Just before dawn, on a single forested mountain on a tropical island in southern China, a sound rises out of the trees that almost no human being alive will ever hear. It is a long, rising, echoing call, a whooping song that carries for miles across the canopy. It is the voice of the rarest ape on Earth. And when scientists finally counted how many of these animals were left to make that sound, the number was so small it barely seemed possible. Every single one of the rarest apes on Earth, every last one, lived on that one mountain, and there were only around 30 of them in the entire world. Not 30,000, not 3,000, around 30 individuals total for the whole species. A great ape, a relative of ours, reduced to a group you could almost fit in a single room, clinging to life on one patch of forest, one storm, or one disease away from vanishing completely. But the astonishing part of this story is not how close they came to the end. It is what happened after someone finally decided they were worth saving. The animal is called the Hainan Gibbon, and it lives only on Hainan Island, a large tropical island off the southern coast of China. Gibbons are not monkeys. They are apes in the same broad family as us, and they are the acrobats of the ape world. They do not walk along branches so much as fly beneath them, swinging hand over hand through the treetops at astonishing speed, crossing gaps that look impossible, living almost their entire lives high in the canopy, and rarely, if ever, touching the ground. They form close family groups, they sing those haunting duets at dawn to mark their territory, and they are utterly dependent on continuous, healthy forest. Take the trees away, and a gibbon has nowhere to go. It cannot cross open ground to reach the next forest. Its whole world is the canopy, and if the canopy breaks, so does its life. There is something else about gibbons that makes their song matter so much. Those dawn duets are not random noise. A mated pair sings together, the male and female weaving their calls into a coordinated performance that announces to the whole forest that this territory is taken and this bond is strong. The song is how a gibbon family holds its place in the world. So when a mountain goes silent, it is not only that the animals are gone, it is that a conversation that had echoed across that forest for longer than anyone can measure has simply stopped. And on Hainan, one mountain after another was going quiet. And on Hainan, the canopy had been breaking for a very long time. Not so many generations ago, gibbons sang across huge areas of Hainan Island. The forests were full of them, likely numbering in the thousands, spread across the tropical woodlands that once covered much of the island. They were simply a part of the place, a common voice in the morning forest. But through the 20th century, that forest was cut down at a devastating pace. Timber was logged, vast areas were cleared and replaced with plantations, rubber trees and pulp trees, planted in neat rows where wild forest used to stand. And a plantation is not a forest. To a gibbon, a rubber plantation is a green desert, with none of the food and none of the connected canopy it needs. As the wild forest shrank into smaller and smaller fragments, the gibbons shrank with it. On top of the habitat loss came hunting, which pushed the collapse even faster. And so, decade by decade, the singing went quiet across the island. Mountain after mountain fell silent as the gibbons disappeared from them. The species was being squeezed into an ever smaller corner of its last remaining forest, and almost no one was paying attention. By the time anyone counted carefully, the situation was catastrophic. The Hainan gibbon, an ape that had once filled the island with song, had crashed to somewhere around 10 individuals. Around 10, living in just one or two family groups, in one last stronghold of forest on one mountain, in a reserve called Bawangling. That was the entire species. A population that small is not just endangered. It is standing at the very doorway of extinction, because a group that tiny can be wiped out by almost anything. One bad typhoon, one outbreak of disease, one landslide in the wrong place, a handful of bad years, and the oldest surviving ape lineage on the island could have blinked out entirely, and the morning song would have been gone forever. That is the point where most stories like this end, quietly, with a species slipping away while the world looks elsewhere. This one did not end there, and the reason it did not is worth understanding. Because someone decided that around 10 gibbons on one mountain were not a lost cause. They were a starting point, China moved to protect what was left. The forest at Bawangling, the gibbons' last refuge, was guarded. The logging that had eaten the island was stopped in the areas that mattered most for the apes. And crucially, the people best placed to protect the gibbons turned out to be the people who knew the forest most intimately, including some who had once hunted in it. Local rangers and monitoring teams were trained to track the gibbon groups day after day, learning each family, following each birth, listening for each morning song. Think about what that means in practice. These teams climb into rugged, steep, tropical forest before sunrise, again and again, for years, to keep watch over animals that spend their lives high in the canopy and can vanish into the leaves in seconds. They come to know the individual apes, their personalities, their movements, which female is carrying a new infant, which young male has left home to seek his own territory. That intimate daily knowledge is not a small thing. For a population this tiny, understanding every single animal is the difference between spotting a problem in time and discovering it too late. The gibbon's survival came to rest, in large part, on the shoulders of a small number of people willing to walk that forest every morning. There is also something quietly powerful in who some of those guardians were. In a place where hunting had helped push the gibbons toward the edge, turning the knowledge of former hunters toward protection instead changed the story. The same skill that could track an animal to kill it could track it to count it, to guard it, to keep it safe. The forest did not need new strangers so much as it needed the people who already knew it best to point that knowledge in a new direction. Degraded forest around the core was allowed to recover, and in places new native trees were planted to slowly expand and reconnect the canopy the gibbons needed. It was slow, patient, unglamorous work, and it ran into a problem that no amount of guarding could solve on its own. This is where the story turns, and it turns on something almost no one would expect. So if stories of a species pulled back from the brink are what you are here for, take a moment to subscribe, because what these teams did to reconnect the forest is the part that still amazes the scientists who saw it. The problem was that the gibbons' habitat was not one clean, continuous block of trees. It was broken, and a particular disaster made it worse. A powerful tropical storm struck the mountain and triggered a huge landslide, which tore a gap straight through the forest, a raw scar of bare ground and rubble cutting across the canopy the gibbons used. For an animal that flies through the treetops and will not cross open ground, that gap was a wall. It threatened to cut one part of the gibbons' range off from another, splitting an already impossibly small population into even smaller, more fragile pieces. For a species down to a few dozen animals, being divided like that could be fatal. So the conservation teams did something clever and strange. If the gibbons could not cross the gap through the trees and would not cross it on the ground, then they would give them a new path through the air. They strung ropes across the landslide gap, a canopy bridge high above the bare scar, anchored into the trees on both sides, designed for an ape that travels by swinging and climbing. And then they waited to see whether the pickiest, most canopy-dependent animals imaginable would trust a couple of ropes strung across a chasm. This was not a sure thing. Gibbons are cautious, and a swaying artificial rope is nothing like the living branches they trust. The teams had no way to force the animals to use it. They could only build it as carefully as possible, anchor it well, place it where the gibbons already wanted to travel, and hope that the pull of the forest on the far side would be stronger than the animal's suspicion of the strange new object. The gibbons used it. They learned to cross the rope bridge, hand over hand, moving between the sections of forest that the landslide had tried to separate. A simple line of rope kept the pieces of their world connected, and kept the tiny population from being split apart at exactly the moment it could least afford it. It was one of the first times anyone had used a canopy bridge to help gibbons like this, and it worked. And slowly, against enormous odds, the numbers began to move in the right direction. This is where you have to understand just how hard it is for gibbons to recover, because it makes what happened even more remarkable. Gibbons are not animals that bounce back quickly. They breed slowly, painfully slowly. A female gibbon gives birth only once every couple of years, to a single infant, and that infant takes years to grow up before it can have young of its own. There is no rapid rebound possible with an animal like this. You cannot flood the forest with babies. Every single new gibbon is the product of years, and every one matters enormously. Building a population back up from around 10 animals, at that speed, is a task measured not in months but in decades. And yet, year by year, birth by birth, it happened. Protected in their forest, monitored constantly, their habitat healing and reconnecting around them, the gibbons slowly climbed. 10 became more. New infants survived. New family groups formed and split off to establish their own territories, which is exactly the sign conservationists most want to see, because it means the population is not just surviving, but growing enough to spread. From that terrifying low of around 10 individuals, the Hainan gibbon has climbed back to somewhere around 35 animals, living in several family groups, in a forest that is slowly expanding to hold them. That may still sound like a tiny number, and it is, but think about what it represents. It is a great ape that was all but written off, an animal that the world could very easily have lost, and instead of vanishing, it is increasing. The morning song that had gone silent across almost the entire island still rises over Bawangling, and there are more voices in it now than there were a generation ago. A species that stood in the doorway of extinction took a step back from it, and then another. Now it is important to be honest about how fragile this still is, because the Hainan gibbon is not saved. It is rescued, which is not the same thing. Around 35 animals in a single location is still one of the most precarious situations of any mammal on Earth. Every one of the old dangers is still real, because they all live on one mountain. A single catastrophe, a severe typhoon, a disease outbreak, a major fire, could still do enormous damage to the entire species at once, because there is no second population somewhere else to fall back on. Their genetic diversity is extremely limited, because every living Hainan gibbon descends from that tiny remnant, and a shallow gene pool can bring its own long-term problems. And their recovery depends completely on the forest continuing to be protected and continuing to expand. Stop the protection, let the habitat shrink again, and an animal that breeds this slowly would have almost no way to withstand it. So this is not a finished story with a neat, happy ending. It is an ongoing rescue that has to be maintained, carefully, for decades to come. The gibbon's survival is not something that happened once. It is something that has to keep happening, every year, through the patient work of the people who guard that forest. But even with all of that honesty, what has been achieved on that one mountain is genuinely extraordinary. An ape fell to around 10 individuals, a number so low that extinction seemed almost inevitable, and human beings chose to stand in the gap. They protected the last forest, they turned former hunters into guardians, they strung ropes across a landslide so the animals could stay connected, and they waited out the agonizingly slow pace of gibbon reproduction, year after year, until the numbers began to rise. At dawn on that mountain in southern China, the rarest ape in the world is still singing. There are only a few dozen of them, all descended from a last handful that came within a whisker of being the end of the line. Every morning that their song rises over the canopy is a morning that very nearly never came. It is the sound of a species that was almost gone, and is not gone, held onto the world by a thread of forest, a few ropes across a chasm, and a decision that even 30 animals were worth fighting for. China found the last few dozen of the rarest ape on the planet, and instead of watching them disappear, chose to bring them back. What happened next was not a miracle. It was something better and harder. It was people refusing to let a voice go silent, and a forest slowly filling, once again, with a song the world had nearly lost forever. If you enjoy true stories of species pulled back from the very edge, stories most people never hear, then like this video and subscribe. In the next one, we will follow another species the world had already written off. Take care of yourself, and stay curious.